policymakers and just people in general can get very, very invested in a particular vision about how the future will unfold, and in so doing fail to anticipate all the other things that might happen, and accordingly fail to make contingency plans.
Right, hello, and welcome to Your Brain on Climate. My name's Dave, and this month we are going to be talking about perhaps one of the most important things, according to my guest, the most important thing about being a human, and that is the ability to travel in time. Well, maybe not really, not like Doctor Who style travelling in time, because that would be very, very silly. But no, what I'm talking about is mental time travel. If you think about it, every time you make a plan for the future, which is like all of the time, little plans, big plans, what you're having for lunch, what you're going to do in 15 years, every time you do that, you're not just kind of pulling that out of your bottom, you're actually imagining what it might be like. And you're thinking about that situation and going, well, maybe if I do X and Y thing, that'll enable A and B outcome to happen. This is a thing that humans do. And as far as we know, only humans do, at least to the level of kind of sophistication that we do it. Without it, we wouldn't have so much of the amazing things that makes being alive so cool. Football stadiums, music, civilization, healthcare, all of that sort of stuff. Someone at some point has sat down and planned them, or perhaps more accurately, loads and loads and loads of people over loads and loads of generations have all done lots of little bits of planning to get us to where we are today. So that's cool. And we also probably wouldn't have a lot of the bad stuff. Like, would there even be a climate crisis in the first place if we hadn't done all of the things that we'd sat down and planned to do, but not really thought enough about the side effects? And this is one of the problems with Foresight. We're quite good at it, but not brilliant. There's an awful lot of stuff we don't foresee, and an awful lot of stuff we probably need to get a little bit sharper at seeing coming, and maybe even more accurately making plans to avoid. So this month we're going to find out all about foresight and memory, which it turns out is just the flip side of foresight. The purpose of memory, it turns out, is to help us make plans for the future. That's what it's for. You may be disappointed by the flakiness of your memory, how things that you'd like to play out as a beautiful film in your head often don't. But that's evolution. That's what we're evolved to do, and we wouldn't have all of this amazing and problematic stuff without it. Joining me is Dr. Adam Bulley, very nice chap, postdoctoral fellow at the Brain and Mind Centre in the School of Psychology in the University of Sydney. So, you know, a thing that we have built with our amazing foresight abilities is the ability for me to talk to someone on the other side of the world. He's also part of Harvard University. He's a cognitive scientist and, most relevantly, one of the co-authors of a really interesting book called The Invention of Tomorrow, which is all about this stuff. Humans invent the future. We do it in our brain. And what we need to get is a lot better, argues Adam, at understanding the power that we have and actually using it to avoid making very silly mistakes vis-a-vis the only place in the universe we can live. As always, if you hear this noise, it denotes wisdom. It means that someone, probably Adam, has said something you might want to check out later at your leisure. Go and check the show notes and you'll find another linky to go and read more things. Thank you to those who keep this show on the road by chipping in a little bit of dosh at Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/yourbrainonclimate, you too can help. And it's important because I pay my guests. It feels right to pay people for their time, particularly people who are coming to talk to me about something they know about and I don't. I can't really do that unless people help me out, which means no podcast. So if you want to join them, do pop on the Patreon at Your Brain on Climate and help out. Great. Okay, so here is the chat with Adam. And before we start talking about thinking about the future, we talk about thinking about the past, specifically memory. And I ask Adam, first of all, if he can remember his earliest memory.
Your brain on climate.
I remember, I know it's a false memory. Does that count? I think I remember being...
I suspect we'll get into that, won't we? Let's have a look.
Yeah, being picked up as a baby. And I think it was like, one of these things that I've seen photos of it happening, and so my brain has kind of fabricated this actual episodic memory of it happening. But I don't think it's true, because I would have been less than one, and you just don't have memories that old. So yeah.
All right. Look, okay. Good. Right. We've started. That's excellent. Because how is it possible?
Straight into it.
Straight into it. How is it possible to have a false memory? Then it's not a memory, right? It's something else.
Yeah, memory is incredibly fallible. I think people are aware of that just from their day-to-day lives. But there's also a really large body of scientific literature on just how fallible our memories can be. The concept of false memory is an interesting one, because it's really an umbrella term to describe any of the kind of recollective experiences or remembrances we have that don't have accordance in reality. So for whatever reason, the brain has fabricated some element of it. And, there's very good evidence showing that people will fabricate things if, for example, you cue them by asking them particular loaded questions. So if someone gets into a car accident or something, and then you say, well, how fast was the car traveling when it smashed into the other vehicle versus how fast was it going when it bumped into the other vehicle, you can skew people's remembrance of how fast the car was going, or at least they'll tell you different speeds on the basis of that. So it's work from people like Elizabeth Loftus and other psychologists that have really put that on firm ground. So our memory is not quite as reliable as we might hope.
There's a memory that I've got of being like really, really little and being in a hospital bed. But I don't think I was, and my parents say that never happened. And so that's a sort of false memory that's in my brain as well, maybe.
Could be. I wouldn't want to hazard a guess. I wasn't there. But, I think it's probably safe to say that we have a lot of memories that didn't really play out exactly as we think they did. It's become increasingly popular in the psychological literature to sort of think of memory as a reconstructive system rather than something that replays the past like a video camera. Instead, when you're remembering something, what the brain is doing is kind of using a set of ingredients from when we experienced and encoded an event, and piecing together the bits and pieces from your banks of memory, your stores of memory, the different elements to kind of reconstitute the experience from the top down. So when you're perceiving something in everyday life, it comes in through the senses and you perceive it. In this case, the brain is producing it from the top down. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about something I do remember, and I'll get in trouble if I don't remember this, which is the day that I met my lovely wife. Right now, I met my lovely wife in a pub. We'd agreed to meet. It's like an internet thing. And I'm thinking, what do I remember about that experience? And it's weird. I can't pick it up and hold it. It's almost like it's a load of, if I think about it, it's a load of little sort of flash images and feelings of that day, right? But it's not like there's a little film playing out in my head that I wish there was. It would be lovely, but I can't access that. It's more just like I can sort of get an image of what she looked like and an image of the beer that I had.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean by the sort of constituent parts that were?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you might get a particular part wrong, even though I'm not going to call you a liar about meeting you, on the day you met your wife. I think I would get in trouble doing that. But, you might be wrong about the specific beer that you were having, or the color of the car the Uber you drove home in, or whatever it was, because it's not a perfect system for record keeping. Instead, you can misattribute particular features from, in the memories. And, this is something I'm sure we'll talk about. But one of the reasons for that, just to kind of expand on why that might be the case, is because memory is not so much useful for just creating a perfect record of what's happened to us before. That can be useful. But what memory is particularly useful for is imagining the future by kind of combining and recombining these little elements, like the concept of the beer, the color of the car, and the people that make up our relationships and our social networks, piecing them all together in novel constellations that enable us to imagine what might happen and therefore prepare for what might happen.
Right, because if my first date with my wife had been on the moon, right, I would probably have a more vivid memory of the experience of being on the moon. But because I've been to a pub 1,000 times, I'm just kind of like putting building blocks in of the pub, right, into that memory. Like kind of, I know what the experience of being in a pub is like, and my brain's going, well, it was like that. And then when I'm thinking to the future, if I think about meeting my mate in the pub next week, it's doing that again. It's going, well, you know what a pub is like because you've been there before. It's kind of got these bits to it. And so I'm not stressed out or worried about the idea of being in a pub, right?
Exactly, yeah. And psychologists would call that a schema. We have all these schemas in our mind, which are kind of scripts about how particular events unfold or what particular places are like or how particular people behave. And all of these schemas can act as efficient shortcuts for conjuring things up in our mind's eye without having to get bogged down in all the nitty-gritty details, which would be an incredibly expensive way to store information and to produce novel ideas. Because this way of doing it, the kind of schema-based way, can be very efficient. As you said, you can use the same pub in your mind's eye to remember meeting your wife and also imagine going to watch a football game. And all you're really having to do is transplant it across the mental timeline from past to future.
I have got... The only thing I'm really scared of is needles. I'm terrified of needles. The idea of it freaks me out. And I don't know why, really. And I was talking to my dad about this the other day, and he goes, well, you know why that is? It's because when you were like, I don't know, I guess like a week old, I was born premature and I was in a tank thing. And they used to come around and give me an injection, and they used to unwrap the syringe, and it used to make a noise. And my dad said, like, it would get to the point where I, at like 4 days old, would hear that noise of the syringe being unwrapped, and I'd start to scream and cry.
Wow.
Right? So there's something kind of really deep implanted in me about that thing, and that makes me think a bit about like animals, because that's kind of what an animal does. If you hit a dog, it's gonna, and then you raise your hand the next time, it's gonna associate that thing, right? So I suppose the question is, do animals, is there something much more primitive and primal about memory? Do animals remember stuff? And is memory something that can operate in that really sort of deep sensory level, not just sort of images that we recall?
Yeah, definitely. And there's great examples from adults who have lost their explicit memories, what we were just referring to before about, remembering the event where you met your wife, and the more base forms of memories that we might subsume under conditioning or learning. People that might have heard of Pavlov's dogs and these kinds of experiments where, you can condition animals to learn things. A good example comes from there's a famous patient who had episodic memory loss, so they couldn't remember the specific episodes from their life. However, the doctor would enter the room, shake the patient's hand, and hide a small prick, like a tack, in their hand while shaking the patient's hand, which would actually prick them. The patient recalls their hand. The next day, the doctor comes back in and the patient says they've never seen the doctor before because they don't have any episodic explicit memory of actually ever meeting that person. And yet when the doctor reaches out the hand to shake the patient's hand and greet them, the patient won't shake the hand because, they know on some level there's a learned response associating that doctor with the experience of pain. And so that shows basically that the kinds of learning and memory which you just mentioned, the kind of conditioning, the fears, the deep-based learning can occur in some sense separately, and it can be differentiated from the kind of memory involved in recollecting specific episodes from one's life. And there are very many other patients that lose this ability to mentally travel in time and recollect events from the past or imagine events in the future for that matter, whilst keeping other kinds of memory intact. For example, their memory of facts, what the capital of France might be. And so these things are dissociable.
And so is there different bits of the brain doing that then? Is like the primitive, we've talked today before about kind of the primitive lizardy bits of the brain that make you run away from stuff, and then the more human bits of the brain. Is the human bit of the brain doing the kind of more thinking forward to the future bit, and something deeper and older and more primitive in the brain doing the recoiling?
That's true. And it's also true that there's a huge amount of interconnectedness in all of these systems. And so what might have previously been thought, and in neuroscience this was thought for a long time, that you might have this kind of triune brain idea, that there's a little bit like tiny lizard in the base of your brain and it's kind of pulling all the strings. And as you walk around, the lizard brain is saying, steal that person's purse or whatever. And the human part of your brain is saying, no, I have to go to work. And it's probably more, the reality is more that the cortex and the parts of the brain involved in creating very conscious, rational thought are heavily interdependent with the mechanisms for emotion, partly because emotions guide our decisions. They help us evaluate things. They are the essence of value, in fact, because without emotion, it's incredibly difficult to make any decision because emotions are what give you the valence, the goodness or the badness of any course of action that you might be considering rationally.
Why? What are we going to do tomorrow night?
The same thing we do every night, Pinky. Try to take over the world.
Right, okay, so you have talked about mental time travel a few times, and I'm going to ask you to explain that a bit. What are you talking about when you say mental time travel?
It's a metaphor for the ability to go backwards and forwards in imagination, to revisit the events from our personal past and to anticipate events that might happen to us in the future. It refers to a cognitive capacity, but it's really the product of a set of interrelated cognitive capacities, like our ability to anticipate what's in the mind of somebody else, or our ability to create a sense of reflection on what our insights might tell us. All these different advanced cognitive capacities kind of coming together to enable us access to both the past and the future. And I might add more access than basically any other animal can do that. But it does seem that humans have a unique access to the fourth dimension that even our closest animal relatives like chimpanzees, while they have some abilities to think ahead, they don't have foresight like we do.
So we can think back to when we met my wife. Well, when I met my wife, you weren't there. And we can think forward to what it might be like if I go for a drink with my wife on our next anniversary in the same pub. And more than that, we can think about what happens if I forget the anniversary, and we can kind of think forward to those sort of things. And that capacity, which would be bad. And those capacities, you reckon, is like not only a uniquely human thing to do, but is almost like the pinnacle of human evolution, like the thing that makes us human.
I think it really had a key role in the human story. It's one of the things that sets us apart as human beings relative to other animals. Just to sort of close the loop on the metaphor itself, one of the reasons to even mention memory and foresight in the same breath is that the patients I mentioned earlier, when they lose access to specific episodic memories of their past, like if you had a certain brain lesion that left you unable to remember meeting your wife at the pub, you would also lose that ability to imagine meeting her in the pub again in the future. And so these two things are actually two sides of the same coin. And so while it is a metaphor to think of a mental time machine, there's a lot of evidence that the same parts of the brain and much of the same cognitive machinery is involved when you're going back and forwards in time. And yes, in the book we've recently written, myself and my two co-authors, Thomas Studendorf and Jonathan Redshaw, The Invention of Tomorrow, that is the key argument, basically, that foresight sets us apart as humans, and it's one of the things that sets us apart, and that it's had a key role in the human story. It's one of the things you just take for granted, but it's absolutely pivotal when it comes to our sense of free will, our obligations to others, the promises we make, our anxieties and our fears, as well as the required actions that it's going to take to tackle some of the problems we face in the world today.
Yeah, and we'll come to that, but it makes sense, right? I'm looking out the window here, and I'm looking at all of the things I can see, which is I'm in London, so it's mostly buildings, and I can see a bus, and thinking, why is it that dogs and chimpanzees don't make buses? And that's because they haven't sat down and thought about how to make a bus, and for all sorts of reasons, like they don't have the ability to do that, right? So kind of we wouldn't have this world that we have now without the ability to sit down and go, how's this going to work out, and how do we make it work better, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there's a collaborative element to that. It's not just one person sitting down and figuring out a bus from scratch. It's you might think of it as a cumulative cultural process where I might sit down and think, yeah, it'd be kind of useful to have something to help get us around. That's a foresightful idea because it's a recognition of a need that I have in the future, and it's going to take time to pursue that goal. So you have the kind of innovation requires foresight, and then you also have mechanisms of foresight that help us collaborate to bring that idea into fruition. So, for example, I might recruit you towards a common goal. I might paint an optimistic picture about what it's going to take to get there. We might enter into a contract or a agreement about what each of us is going to do. And maybe over time, what you also find is that people teach one another, which is foresightful in essence, because it involves one person who knows how to do something intentionally passing on lessons for another person who doesn't currently have knowledge, but will need it in the future to tackle some problem that they don't currently have in front of them.
Yeah, and you wouldn't teach me and somebody much cleverer than me in the same way either. You have to kind of know a bit about, like, you have to be able to anticipate how me, a thickie, learns about something as opposed to someone who is not a thickie learns about something. So all of that kind of, you have, like, again, the act of teaching itself, right, requires you to be able to think to the future.
Yeah, I think so. I think teaching is incredibly far-sighted act because it does exactly involve a kind of strategizing about how the other person is going to receive the information which you have. And then on the receiver's end, there's something else very far-sighted in the acquisition of knowledge, which is practice. Because in order to create something important and useful, the skills don't just appear out of nowhere. The person receiving knowledge has to practice it. And to practice is really unlocked, at least deliberate practice is unlocked by the ability to voyage forwards in time and anticipate the payoffs that we'll get in the future for doing something now that we might not actually want to be doing. And so there's a kind of, and this actually comes back to what we were mentioning before about emotions. There has to be some kind of emotional payoff in the very act of imagining the benefits of patience and practice that enables you to stay focused in the here and now in pursuit of that goal.
Which, of course, a lot of people don't do because they can't be asked, right?
Or it's just really hard. The future is incredibly nebulous, and it's as you get further and further away in time, it becomes increasingly more vague. And so it is increasingly more difficult to interface the emotions that enable us to evaluate whether something's good or bad or, worth fighting for with the mechanisms involved in foresight, which in essence require us to conjure up something completely fictitious and plonk it in the distance.
Look at that. Right. And before we move off that, because that is interesting stuff, it also suggests to me that this idea that humans are all just self-standing little islands and that it's all survival of the fittest sort of stuff doesn't actually make any sense. I mean, it doesn't make any sense in lots of reasons anyway, but not only could I not go out and make a bus if I wanted to, I wouldn't know how to make a bus. Not only that, but even what the concept of a bus has been, it's an intensely cooperative thing and has been passed down all the way through society. So is there something about what you have been writing about that sort of makes you, every time you hear someone go, oh, well, I'm a self-made man and all that nonsense, makes you kind of laugh at it or what?
I think it's definitely true that human beings are incredibly cooperative and collaborative, and essentially nothing happens without the bath of culture surrounding us, and culture in the capital C sense, where encompassing all of our norms and rituals and jokes and languages and fashion senses and haircuts and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That kind of culture we're so immersed in it that it's actually sometimes difficult to even recognize it. And what you're doing there with the thing with the bus, you might take something like that for granted, but in fact, it's the product of literally thousands and thousands of people in a long chain of history, all making their own little subtle changes to the ideas and the device itself, eventually resulting in something which one person can use. But at the same time, every individual person in that chain has to use their own rationality, has to use their own intelligence, has to use their own foresight to anticipate what they're trying to achieve and work towards it. And so there's this interesting kind of bidirectional relationship between our individual smarts and the collaborative cultural evolutionary process that gives rise to technologies and ways of doing things that we value.
Your brain on climate.
Okay, let me just check I've got this right so far. So, memory, the ability to think backwards to stuff, and foresight, the ability to think forwards to stuff, you say is basically the same kind of thing. And in your book, there's something you say, I think memory is for the future, or I've got that somewhere. So the whole purpose of memory, the whole point of it is to help us make better plans in the future. Yes?
Right, yeah.
So that's what it's doing for us. And that explains then why memory, and we talked about this earlier on, is sometimes crappy and lets us down, because it's not designed to be a perfect recall system.
Yeah, exactly. It's not even for that, really. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
That change of perspective helps you try and make sense of some of the seeming design flaws in memory, when you start to realize that, well, its real function might be more about what it gives us when it comes to preparing for the future. And so the flexibility and the open-endedness of memory, the ability to put all these little bits and pieces together, while it gives rise to lots of errors, it also is the thing that's responsible for enabling us to be so generative and imaginative when it comes to putting together ideas about what might happen next.
So it's not really, you've called it mental time travel. It's not really mental time travel. It's more like mental educated guesswork, kind of based on stuff that's gone before. And like, so 100%,
it goes, it's not wrong. Clairvoyance. It's not clairvoyance. Yeah, I put that on the table basically at the same time you did. It's like, yeah.
But it's allowing us, it is allowing us to go, okay, I can see X might happen, and therefore I need to do Y, and that's kind of right. So we've got that. But it's not all, I mean, there's a whole load of stuff that strikes me that a lot of things about why being alive could be difficult sometimes comes down to this problem. Like, for example, worries about a presentation you have to do, or a gig you have to play, or something like that, right? Let's take the presentation example. Next week, you've got to do a big presentation at work or something, and you're terrified of it. It makes your palms go all sweaty. What is happening in the brain there? You're imagining all the times in your life when something has gone terribly wrong and forecasting it forward to that.
Yeah, you might be remembering specific instances where you've made errors before. You might be generatively creating mutually exclusive possible ways that it all could go pear-shaped. And one of the really powerful things about foresight and mental time travel is that it is so open-ended, and we can entertain lots of different ways that things could play out because it's so generative. But that is also one of the most painful things about it, as you just mentioned, because when it comes to preparing for the presentation, you can say, oh, maybe I will trip over on the way up to the microphone. Maybe the sound will cut out. Maybe I will have I'll start getting really nervous. The list goes on. So yes, our anxieties are probably uniquely bad in the animal kingdom, because we have access to all these different possible futures where things go wrong, which is a little different than just feeling anxious about what could go wrong. Where you do see, for example, other animals will respond with a heightened state of awareness and anxiety-like traits when something in their environment is off.
Going to the vet.
Yeah, absolutely.
Used to take the cat to the vet. The cat knew it was going to the vet, and it literally shat itself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And what the cat is probably not doing is sitting perfectly calmly in bed at the end of a nice day, eating lots of treats and ruminating about the next vet visit.
That's how you got it. You sneak up on it. That's how you do it.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. Whereas by contrast, I could be very happily lying in bed at the end of a day, and all of a sudden now you're mulling over all of the things that could go wrong tomorrow. And so this is a very human feature of our imaginations, and both a blessing and a curse.
Well, as is the other thing that's happening here, and I am engrossed. I promise you, I'm engrossed in this conversation. It is really interesting. But I would be lying if I said there wasn't a little tiny bit of my brain going, I've got to remember to go shopping after I've had this chat with Adam. And then later on, seeing a friend, and and so it's always bloody going, Adam. Like this foresight thing is always there. Right?
Yeah, mine's reminding me of the dinner waiting for me after this call, because I'm down in Sydney while you're probably anticipating your breakfast in London. Yeah. It's really one way of thinking about it is that it's something that the brain really defaults to when there's nothing more pressing in the immediate environment, or when you just have very minor lapses in the pressures that are in front of you. And the brain is basically doing a kind of delicate balancing act, because there's a real utility in planning ahead, obviously, because as you just mentioned, all the things that make up an average person's life are kind of organized around timescales. You have to keep intentions in mind. You have to execute them after a particular delay. This is absolutely critical, but it's also really important to engage in the present. And so there has to be some kind of mechanism in the brain to allocate attention towards the sensory environment around you and the internal simulations that we cook up on a moment by moment basis to help us organize our lives. And how it does that is very interesting and in many ways an open question, because it's quite a complicated phenomenon, but it's also something that people care about training. So something like mindfulness meditation is an active effort to put the focus back on the here and now, and it is hard. Yeah, as soon as you try it for a few minutes, all that stuff goes into overdrive.
Okay, right. So let's talk about bloody climate change then. And it seems that two things may be true at the same time, but tell me if this is the case. Thing number one, all of this climate change that we've got is happening, crudely, because we have invented stuff that's turned out to be a bit of a problem, right? Be that getting oil out of the ground and burning it, or other stuff like that, right? Crudely, humans and their amazing abilities have made a problem because of what our brains can do. On the other side of things, we only know it's a problem because of our brains, right? So we've had, science and the whole of the scientific endeavor has told us that we need to do something about it. So we're equally cursed and blessed in that regard. Firstly, do you recognize that? Is that too crude? But also,
no, that's great.
Is science itself therefore one of the best things we've ever done with the Foresight ability?
Yeah, interesting. I think that's a very nice way of putting that sort of fundamental tension about the powers and pitfalls of technology and also foresight writ large, because many of these technologies we were alluding to earlier, I mean, even the bus, not to blame poor old buses for everything, but they are, many of our technologies were made with good intentions and with, no particular person having an evil plot to create some horrible future, but instead produce byproducts that, while foresight was critical for generating the thing itself, we weren't quite foresighted enough to anticipate the run-on consequences of some of the things we've created. And so there is a tension there. And as for what was the second part of the
No, I'm sorry. I'm always doing this for people. I'm always going, and 19thly, if you could remember. Well, science itself, right? Science itself as a methodology is about going, last time I set fire to that Petri dish, it wasn't good. So I'm going to try and set fire to it in a different way this time.
Yeah, science itself is really, foresight is at its core, because at the heart of the scientific method is really the effort to create and then explicitly falsify hypotheses about what might happen if you take certain actions in the world. That's a very reductive way of breaking down science, but it's broadly the case and about how it works. And so, yes, science is foresightful. It's also immensely collaborative. The scientific method has been built up over generations. And so it's actually a shared project between people who may have never shared the planet, but nonetheless had a common goal of trying to understand the world better and maybe use that in a good way. At the same time, science suffers from the perils of any other tool that we've created, which is that it can be used for incredibly useful ends, like identifying the runoff effects of some of our technologies, but also for creating the technologies and the weapons and so on that put us into a pickle in the first place. So again, it's a double-edged sword, and it's really about wielding it effectively. It's not something to just be widely celebrated.
Yeah, we talked about this a bit so far. Should be able to, you would have thought, and I think you get a lot of this in some campaigning. People go, look, we can see that climate change is coming. We can see it's there. Science, which is this amazing thing, is telling us it's coming. Therefore, we need to all stop burning oil immediately, right? There we are. Reductive. But it don't work like that, does it? Any more than it works like me going, yeah, I shouldn't have that cake now, but I quite want to have that cake now, and so I have it. And so it feels like that sort of the way that it doesn't really do us any good on the human level to always think about what's good for us doesn't seem to happen at a societal or planet level either.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, the same kinds of biases and heuristics and errors in foresight that play out in our individual lives. There's not an exact analogy to the things that happen at the collective and global scales, but there is an analogy, and they are close because obviously collectives are made up of individual people, as we've already talked about. And so, yes, I think for example, one of the things that kind of plagues human foresight or makes it difficult is that we discount events, outcomes, rewards and punishments as they move further and further away into the future. It's very well characterized.
Discounting as in literally give less of a shit about them.
Exactly. You care less about it. Yeah, discount as a verb. To discount the advice of someone is in the same way you discount the impact of something that happens in the future as long as it's tucked away neatly out of sight and out of mind in the fog of the future. And so that is, it makes evolutionary sense, and it's something we share with basically every other animal, is that the discounting occurs because the future is uncertain, at least in part. As soon as you move into the future, there's uncertainty that the thing that you wanted, for example, now is less likely, and so you should care less about it. Like, so for example, if I'm waiting for a second marshmallow because an experimenter has come in and put down one in front of me and said, if you wait for the second one, then I'll give you two, and you can eat to your heart's content. But the children, if they're being kind of clued on, one of the reasons they won't wait for a second marshmallow in those kinds of tasks, and one of the reasons we won't save for retirement, is because there's no guarantee that the second marshmallow will actually come about. The experimenter might have lied to you, or the banks might go under where you're keeping all your nest egg. And so, that kind of uncertainty.
By the aforementioned bus as well.
By a bus, yeah, absolutely right, yeah.
No, but I suppose that makes sense, doesn't it? And that's why, there's a whole lot. So I did some economics once, right? And there's a load of stuff in there about how people would generally rather have a tenner today than have a tenner next week, or have, 11 quid. What would you rather have, a £10 today or 11 quid next week? Most people are going to probably have £10 now, right? Because you have it in your hand, you know what you can do with it, and it's available to you now. And that feels like kind of a nice metaphor for what we're doing with climate change, which is we quite like having all this nice stuff now, and all this progress, and all of these nice whizzy things. And
again, there is some logic to it, just to put a fine point on that, not to labor it, but there is some logic in that, because obviously, like I mentioned, the future is uncertain, and so there is a kind of point at which, taking in mind interest rates and all that, it actually makes sense to take what you can get now. And that's especially true. And this might, in fact, unfortunately be one of the additional barrier to dealing with something like climate change, is that when you're in an environment that's incredibly unstable or that feels very dangerous, the logic for getting what you can now becomes more and more stark, because the benefits of patience are made less and less clear. If the uncertainty is greater, there's just simply less and less potential benefit to be gained from patiently sort of saving for the future or investing in later returns. Maybe that comes, I'd be interested to hear your point, your opinion on this, about whether campaigning for climate change runs a risk of being pessimistic, because pessimistic, kind of giving the sense of great uncertainty, which might encourage people to just say, oh, well, stuff it then, if I can't do something about it, then why is it my problem?
Yeah, I think
run into that.
There's a huge amount of that sort of thing goes on. Yeah, where you can't. It is important. I mean, this is what people say. It is important to get people to realize climate change is a problem, and to sort of, connect them to it and stuff. But if you just make people think something is terrible and it's going to happen anyway, and there's nothing they can do about it, well, what would you do? I'd go to the pub. And whereas if there was a sense that, but there is something you can do about it, and that the thing you're going to do about it does not necessarily mean not having any marshmallows, then that gives people a sense of connection to it, right? And I suppose, let's think about how we could kind of hack this foresight thing that we've got. Is that a thing that, in general, makes people make better decisions, as if they can kind of imagine and see and not be scared by the thing that might happen 20 years in the future? They can imagine it happening to them in a much more vivid way than it being a sort of fluffy might happen sort of thing.
Yeah, there are a lot of ways to actually really harness that. So there's been just on the very small scale, there's been experiments. I've done some research on this where if you get people to just imagine the future more concretely and you just get them to just literally imagine the future for a few moments before they're making exactly the kinds of decisions you mentioned before, like would they rather have £10 now or £15 in a month, then you can make them more willing to wait for the later amount of money because you've got them to imagine the future in more vivid detail. So there's a burgeoning literature on that. Lots of different people have started to try and roll that out in different kinds of contexts. Everywhere that it matters that people would wait for a later reward. So, like think about pensions. Your pensions. So, exactly.
Yeah, right.
Those kinds of environment. But there's also more sophisticated ways of doing that. Things like Hal Hirschfield, the scientist, a psychologist, has done studies where he shows people kind of virtual reality progressed faces, their own face, but progressed in age. And looks at how that influences their willingness to save for retirement, and it does. Encourages people to put more money into their retirement savings if they interact with a virtual reality age progressed rendering of their own self. And so from his point of view, that's about connecting more deeply with your future self, the person that you will eventually become. So those are just two examples, and I think the arts have a big role to play here. There's a lot of fascinating work being done. And I think that this would be really backed in the science, because it's quite clear that if you can get people to imagine the future more clearly and more vividly, they are more willing to sacrifice in the present in pursuit of later gains.
Meet George Jetson!
One of the things in climate change that I think we need is those visions of the future, which are actually positive, exciting ones that make you go, yeah, I do like the sense of sticking around for that and being alive in that. And we kind of lost visions of the future. The Jetsons was good at it, and the 50s was good at kind of visions of the future, but we don't really have those kind of positive visions anymore. And it is quite hard for me to imagine what the year 2050 will be like with or without climate change. So maybe I like the idea of more artistic visions and being able to see yourself in them.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a massive role for that, the kind of speculative futures and imagining all the really good ways things could play out. Not to be a Debbie Downer on this, but I think optimism is a double-edged sword again. Sorry, that's my favorite term today by the look of it. But optimism can be really useful in these kinds of cases. But again, it's a tool like any other, because it can also be used to mobilize us to do things that are really bad. If Wall Street crashes and financial bubbles, the psychologist Tali Sharot has written a fantastic book called The Optimism Bias, all about this, showing both not to say poo-poo optimism entirely, but to strike a balance. We need optimism to tackle the big problems ahead of us, but we also have to be aware that it can develop into a bit of a bias to overconfidence, because people want to think that the world will turn out fine for them and the people they love. And so there's a tendency for us to downplay bad news when there's something we care about that we're trying to achieve. And that can be a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where we get really, really excited about, for example, some speculative market investment. And then if everybody does that, because we all get caught up in the excitement, then you run the risk of creating bubbles, for example. And so, optimism is I think from my point of view, I think optimism is a tool to use, and it's something to be harnessed, and it's something to really recognize the adaptive powers of it, but to be quite mindful at the same time of its potentially, honestly, quite devastating costs if it gets carried away.
Something else I was thinking about what you said before was about, if life is tough, who can blame anyone for having the marshmallow now or having the £10 now, rather than thinking about the future? And there's a lot of that that we need to think about in climate stuff as well, I think, because life is tough for a lot of people, particularly right now. And a lot of those people are often the ones who are portrayed as being resistant to progress or, wanting to get in the way. And it does, from a sort of psychological point of view, it makes you realize, well, obviously people kind of need to feel that this is going to be good news for them, and that it's that it's not just something that's going to take away what little they've got, right? So it kind of points to the work on Foresight, points to allowing people not to feel that the future is going to be worse than it already is, right, and meaning it.
Yeah, definitely. And maybe having just a bit more empathy for people in those kinds of circumstances, because you can maybe start to realize that it's not that people don't have foresight. They might have just used their foresight to come to the conclusion that the better thing to do is get what they can now. That's a subtle distinction, but it is an important one, because if we don't recognize that, we run the risk of just writing people off as impulsive, short-sighted, or just lacking foresight. But I think foresight is a universal human trait. It develops from around 4 years old in young children. It's essentially every healthy, functioning adult has foresight. It's just that what we choose to prioritize and focus on differs. And so when we say that people are being impulsive or short-sighted, often that's actually a value judgment from our point of view that fails to take into account their particular circumstances, where they might indeed be in an environment where it just doesn't pay to delay gratification for some anticipated return. So yeah, just having a bit more empathy for like the kind of the environments that would shift people's priorities, and then actively trying to alleviate those conditions. I think it's a truism that if you could raise the standard of living for people in poorer places, that's going to have double returns, in the sense that it might simultaneously improve their quality of life while also making them more rationally more inclined to prioritize later threats and benefits. It's not that those people are being dumb or short-sighted by not doing that. It's just that they've farsightfully realized it's not in their best interests.
Good evening. Tonight we celebrate our last Tomorrow's World of a decade which has been both exciting and perhaps a little frustrating by finding out how some of the projects we've covered in the 70s are shaping up as we move into the 80s.
Yeah,
and
right.
we start our program.
As a scientist, what do you think about the role of science in policy making? So one of the conclusions I'm drawing from this is we need, at the government, cultural, political level, to be much better at foresight than we are and making plans. You look at things like pandemic preparedness and indeed climate preparedness, and governments just kind of don't. Well, they may have the foresight, but they don't act on it accordingly. It feels to me, in a world of complicated, overlapping threats, we need to get a lot better at the government level at having foresight.
Yeah, there's one other thing that governments might fail to do is, when it comes to foresight, is they might fail to make multiple alternative plans. So it's okay, it's good, it's useful to make a plan. So take pandemic preparedness as an example. You might have the United States government pandemic preparedness plan or something like that. I recently read Premonition, a great book covering the kind of preparedness that was in place and the failings where it wasn't in place for tackling the climate crisis. And the thing is, you need to recognize that the future is actually a multiple branching possibilities spin off from the present in the future. It's not just a single kind of tram line that runs in one direction. And so I think this comes back to the optimism point. Policymakers and just people in general can get very, very invested in a particular vision about how the future will unfold, and in so doing fail to anticipate all the other things that might happen, and accordingly fail to make contingency plans. And so I think one of the things I would really advocate for in policy and elsewhere is really leveraging that recognition, that ability that we mentioned at the beginning, the open-endedness of our foresight, to codify multiple alternative plans to tackle what might happen, and to sort of have a skepticism, use the same kind of skepticism you find in science, where we're trying to falsify our own hypotheses, apply that to our plans as well. Be really skeptical about our plans. Yeah, including
the what happens if it doesn't work plan. So they're kind of having a plan for what happens if everything you've tried goes wrong, right? Which seems to be a thing you're lacking as well. Yeah, I
think you need backups for the backups. You need plan C's, D's, E's, and so on down the list. And obviously there are resource constraints to that, and there are other reasons why it's costly. But at the same time, it's also incredibly useful because it enables you to be, you're not found flat-footed when something goes wrong.
So you, Dr. Adam Bulley, co-author of The Invention of Tomorrow, one of the world's leading experts in cognitive psychology and foresight. What do you do in your daily life to make better decisions? Have you got any hacks you can pass on to people and any tricks? Because I bet you're every bit as prone to daydreaming and not planning for the future as anyone else. So what do you do about it?
Well, maybe more so even. I think it's a common trope in psychology that people study the specific things that they themselves are lacking. Maybe you'd have to ask my fiance about my lack of foresight in certain ways. But no, there are tricks. And one of them is it comes out of a skepticism about my own foresight. So coming to realize how error prone this ability is, and also recognizing how powerful it can be, trying to harness it for the better. I do things like pre-commit to courses of action that I know I would otherwise fail to enact. So I try to just basically set up my environment and commit to things in advance, because I recognize that I might, for example, forget to do something, even though in the moment I think, I could definitely remember that. But time and again, evidence is there. You don't remember. And so I use a lot of lists, and if there's a good intention that I want to really come good on, pre-commitment is a way to do that, where you kind of tie your own wrists to enact something. And so those are really workarounds. They're not attempts to make your foresight better, which I think is actually can be very difficult. There are ways to do that, but it's tricky. I think the more realistic approach, and this applies, I think, both for individual people, but again, coming back to the governance kind of scale, pre-commitment devices can be incredibly useful because they mean that we can use our best intentions in the moment to put into practice the best ideas, preventing the rising emotions of later circumstances from curtailing those good ideas.
Yeah, which is why I guess like governments committing to targets for things like climate reduction, although the targets themselves are a bit crappy often. It means they have to keep going back and going, what are we doing about this thing we said we would do, right? In the same way that if I commit to doing a half marathon in 4 months, which I have, you have to bloody well do the training, right?
And there you go. And you've just done another little hack right there, which is to publicly commit to a goal. And that works as well. Yeah. So maybe you should have thought twice before saying that out loud, because now you're really pre-committed.
But what you've forgotten is that I can edit that out.
All right. Perfect.
Adam, thank you so much for coming on Your Brain on Climate. Remind everyone what the book is called. Is it an audiobook as well? I know it's an audiobook as well because I listen to it. But how can people get hold of those things?
Nice, great. Yeah, no, it's called The Invention of Tomorrow: A Natural History of Foresight. It was written by Thomas Sudendorf, Jonathan Redshaw, and myself, Adam Bulley. And I think you can find me on Twitter at Adam D Bulley. And thanks for having me on. That was a really fun conversation.
Right, that was that. Thank you so much for listening. That was a brilliant episode. I loved doing it. I loved that chat. And do let me know what you think of it. I'm on the Twitter at BrainClimate, or you can email hello@yourbrainonclimate.com. A reminder, please, if you've enjoyed this episode, if you want to go and listen to other ones in the back catalogue, if you want to chip in a couple of quid as a thank you or to keep this show on the road, you can do that at Patreon, at patreon.com/yourbrainonclimate. I pay my guests. That means I need a bit of help to do that. So we have great episodes, great show for everyone. If you like what you've heard, do pop onto Apple Podcasts or any other place that lets you leave a review. Give me a lovely review, write some words with your hands. It really, really helps, particularly for a new podcast that's trying to build an audience. And it just makes me feel nice. And if you want to make me feel nice, I am certainly not going to stop you doing that. Right, terrific, I'm off. I shall be back round about this time next month. Until then, look after yourselves, and I will see you very soon. Okay, bye!